Hello and welcome to the Brutal Iron Gym podcast, where our goal is to cut through the BS and deliver the brutal truth about topics related to health and happiness. Today's podcast is number 1361. The topic is training and the title is Progressing from Body Weight Squat to Barbell Squat. So what we're going to do today is we're just going to talk through a sample of a way you can progress either yourself or if you're a trainer you can progress a client from first learning body weight squats to eventually getting a barbell on their back. Now, this is stuff that I sometimes will struggle with how to make a podcast that is universal because the process of doing this isn't always universal. For various reasons. People always have different backgrounds, different concerns, issues, whatever, that might be a limiter for them as to why they can't barbell squat right now. Some people it's injury concerns, past injuries, surgeries, a whole bunch of stuff. I trained a young guy one time, he was 17 or 18, and unfortunately he had worked with a previous trainer who tried to make him squat very heavy one day. The young guy definitely wasn't strong enough. He got kind of halfway down the bar, then rolled up over his head, fell to the floor. The kid fell forward and made a big loud noise. He felt super embarrassed, and his dad, he said it took him like months and months to talk him back into going to the gym. So we eventually met up, and I was able to kind of work with him. And he had fine squatting mechanics, but holy crap was he scared coming back. So that first trainer, unfortunately, damn near killed his kid, and that really crushed his confidence. So whenever him and I had to work together, it was mostly a confidence issue, not like a squat mechanics or he couldn't do certain movements. He just didn't feel confident. Some people are just going to have super stiff, tight muscles. Some people are just going to be really poor body coordination. There's going to be a lot of reasons why people will have trouble progressing from a bodyweight squat to a barbell squat. So I wanted to give an example of how I progress somebody through. But this is something that you'll have to kind of tweak and kind of figure it out for yourself as you go through it. The first thing we would do is get somebody to do a bodyweight squat to a bench. That's typically something you can get, almost anybody to understand and hopefully get them to. So when I train clients 60s, 70s, 80s, this is something we cover all the time because they have to learn how to sit down and stand up without having their hips tucked underneath them, without them having to hold on or pull up, from something or push off their knees. We want them to be able to sit down, stand up without needing upper body assistance. So I can do this, pretty much with anybody who walks through the door. They should be able to sit down in the chair and stand up out of a chair. So they can probably start with some bodyweight squats to a bench. Now, what's the depth at which you choose? Typically, I have people sit at normal bench height. So if you're in a gym setting, whatever your normal height for your flat bench or your adjustable bench is good enough. Roughly, the height of a normal chair. You're not going to try to be crazy and have them sit 6 inches off the ground. But likewise, you don't want them to sit on something so high they only have 2 or 3 inches of range of motion. So I would go with a normal chair height or whatever the bench is at whatever gym you're at. That would be the thing we look at to start with. You'd want to have them at their feet being as wide or slightly wider than their shoulders. That's going to be a width that most people are going to need as they progress up to a barbell squat. So you don't want them to squat up and down, like sitting down onto the bench and stand back up with their feet super narrow. That's not going to feel very comfortable for them probably because that forces their hips to be even further behind kind of the center line of gravity. So their lower back and hips and even just their ability to stretch their hamstrings and glutes might be limited by that narrow position. So you want their feet to be at shoulder width or slightly wider. And the main issue is just going to be their ability to hinge at their hips, to keep their lower back flat as they push their hips back. So that's going to be the main issue. Typically, the reason why that's an issue is because they have very tight and very weak glutes and hamstrings. So you have to work on the mobility and opening up the glutes and hamstrings. So there's a cross-legged glute stretch that I like that you can find on YouTube if you just type in Brutal Iron Gym cross-legged glute stretch. and legged is Legged, so cross-legged glute stretch. Now you can do that on a quadruped position, like hands and knees on the ground, or if you have somebody with blood pressure issues, you don't want to get them on the ground, or just older and you don't want to get them on the ground. You can do it seated, on a bench. You can sit them down on the bench and do what's called like a pretzel stretch. There's variations of all that stuff, but you want to work on their internal external rotation and kind of the stretching and opening up of the glutes and the hamstrings. One of the other things I do is I cue them as they're like thinking of sitting down onto the bench. Once their feet or shoulder width are slightly wider apart, I want them to think of like they're trying to reach to the ground to touch something that's between their feet. So if I were to set something between their feet, I want them to think of pushing their butt back like they're reaching down between their feet to pick something up. Now, that might cause them to round their upper back at first. Not really that big of a concern at first. You're just trying to get them to push their hips back rather than their knees forward. So this is something where the general technique kind of advice of knees not going past the toes would be a good thing to focus on. And then also telling them that as they squat, their chest and their belly button may need to point down more towards the floor. So the torso being upright when they're standing and talking to you can't maintain being upright as they squat. They do have to hinge at the hip and kind of, if there's a laser pointer coming out of their belly button, they have to point that laser down to the floor. So you're trying to get them to understand the concept of letting their torso tilt like angle forward while their shoulders stay over their knees and their butt goes back. That's pretty much what anybody would be doing in a bodyweight squat to a bench. And that's why I tell them to reach between their feet, because they would then feel, if their shoulders are going forward, they would feel that they're reaching out in front of their toes. You don't want them to do that. So you want their shoulders to stay directly over their feet and their butt goes back, not their knees going forward. So this is the first thing we would do. Try to get them to where they can understand those mechanics. So you have them bodyweight squat to a bench and trying to get those mechanics to look normal. Then a thing you can progress to from there is picking up a kettlebell. Now, if you don't have kettlebells in your gym, you can just set a dumbbell on the floor, but have it upright rather than laying flat on the floor. Have it upright. But I do like kettlebells because it's just a convenient handle. But have them do the same mechanics of trying to do a bodyweight squat to the bench, but they're going to reach down and pick up a kettlebell. Now, if it's a 10-pound kettlebell and their butt hits the bench before they can reach the kettlebell, elevate the kettlebell on a couple 25 or 10-pound plates. Okay? But that would be a good way to get them used to the positioning of bending over, like hinging at their hips. Their shoulders are staying over their feet. And this is a loaded mechanics. So this is going to teach them how to do core bracing, how to kind of load the the hips. Like you want the stress of the lift to be in their hamstrings, butt, and lower back. They can feel that kind of holding the weight. So the pressure in their feet should be midfoot to heels, not in their toes. So they shouldn't feel picking up a kettlebell in that position to be stressful in their knees or their quadriceps. You want them to feel pressured in their heels. Their knees are staying out like over top their heels. Their butt is going back, and when they go to pick up the kettlebell, they can feel their core muscles bracing. They can feel their butt and their hamstrings having to squeeze to stand up. So a kettlebell pickup out of a bodyweight squat to a bench. That is going to be a great, great, great way to introduce them to loading the tissues in a squatting mechanics. Now, something that I used to do when I was younger, and you'll still see trainers do, as in their newer parts of their career, whatever, is they'll have people do a goblet hold for a squat, a loaded squat. The downside, a goblet hold, if you don't know what that is you hold a dumbbell or a kettlebell or a weight, kind of at chest height out to the front of your body. The reason why it's called a goblet is if you put your hands in front of you where your palms are facing up towards the ceiling, it looks like a cup. So if you don't know what any of the things I'm talking about are, you can pause the podcast and just search like kettlebell goblet hold squat or dumbbell goblet hold squat. And you'll see that that's a front-loaded squat. The reason why I'm not as much of a fan of that anymore is that doesn't teach the loading mechanics the same way that the weight load will feel with a barbell back squat. A front-loaded squat mimics more so a front squat. We're not trying to progress them to a front squat, we're trying to progress them to a back squat. So you want to make sure that their torso can hinge forward, have a forward tilted angle, just like they would need to do in a barbell back squat. When you pick up a kettlebell off the ground and their shoulders are staying over their heels, that is actually the proper stress line, thrust line of where the barbell would be. So if you were to take a picture of somebody's body, just the way their body looks, when they're doing a kettlebell deadlift versus a goblet squat, a kettlebell deadlift mimics more so a barbell back squat than a goblet squat does. A goblet squat mimics more of a front squat. So sometimes you'll hear trainers give somebody, they'll give them a goblet hold weight, like dumbbell or kettlebell, but then they'll cue the person to push their hips back. Well, if you're holding something at your chest, your hips go back, your chest and your belly have to angle towards the floor. That thing you're holding at your chest gets really freaking heavy and hard. So they won't want to push their hips back. So you're giving them a weight load that counters the cue you're trying to tell them to do. So this is why I like kettlebell pickups instead of a goblet hold position. Okay. Now, what you want to do is you eventually want them to do the kettlebell pickup without the bench. You're going to have them basically just do kettlebell deadlifts. It's going to be in their squat width stance, and you're going to have them do kettlebell deadlifts essentially. Now, what you want to try to teach at this is you want them to be able to reach the deadlift whenever their squat is at parallel. So when their hips are at the same height as their knees, and again, if you don't know what this means, just pause the podcast and search on YouTube for parallel squat, and you'll see 40 billion images of that. But you want them to be able to touch the kettlebell and grab it before they go below parallel, but to make sure they actually get to parallel, where their hips and knees are at the same height. This might mean that you have to elevate the kettlebell. It might mean you have to elevate the person. So maybe they need to stand on a couple plates or something so that way they can get their hips down to their knees before they touch the kettlebell. But you want them to get to doing kettlebell deadlifts without any bench. This is going to help improve the mobility for them to get into that position, and then strengthen the full range of motion of that position, which then improves mobility long term because they have the strength to get to that position. But this is again going to teach them mechanics that are more similar to a barbell back squat than a goblet loaded movement or front loaded movement would. So once they feel comfortable doing a kettlebell pickup without the bench, we then can move them to squatting with a PVC pipe. PVC pipes are like $1 at Home Depot or Lowe's, so pretty cheap. Have them try to squat, mimic the same mechanics as if they were going to pick up the kettlebell, but they're going to hold a PVC pipe up across their upper back just like they would with a barbell. If they're a little nervous at first, you can go back to have them do it to a bench or a box, but eventually you want them to do a PVC pipe squat without the box or without a bench. So one of the things this starts to be able to introduce the mechanics of how to brace and stabilize a barbell on their upper back. We have a great video for that. There's 2 parts, so part 1 and part 2. If you go to YouTube, search Brutal Iron Gym Squat Setup. Now the title's longer than that, but that'll get you to the titles. It's me showing video, talking my mom through how she sets up her squats. So that's going to be a great video. Teaches how to do upper body stabilization with the barbell, but you'll be using it with a PVC pipe at first. So great way to introduce that. Now, if the person has kind of weak core, or kind of like they have a risk of a lower back injury or pain, this is when you can play around with the concept of elevating the heels. Now, I do have a podcast about whether you should elevate your heels or not, and you typically would do that with Olympic lifting shoes. But you can also just have the person stand under a metal like 10-pound plate or a rubberized 5-pound plate, something that gives them like a 1/2 inch to a 3/4 inch heel elevation. We have podcast number 807, which is a training podcast titled "Should I Wear Olympic Lifting Shoes When I Squat?" That would be a great way to kind of just listen to whether you think the person you're training or yourself should have your heels elevated or not. Now, why would you elevate your heels? If you elevate your heels, it allows for a more upright torso when you squat. This transfers stress load away from the lower back and more into the quadriceps. So if their lower back is a risk issue for pain or injury, then elevating the heels can allow them to have a more upright torso, and that can reduce the stress load on the lower back. Now, it's a trade-off. So you are putting more stress load into the knees. So you have to be aware of where do you want your stress. Do you want the stress in the lower back or the knees? Now, if you're like, I don't want it in either, that might cause them to not be able to squat to parallel if you're trying to not load either tissue too far, but they can't quite make it to parallel with their feet flat. So what you can do is elevate their heels just to reduce overall stress and then not have them go to parallel. For some people, going to parallel isn't necessary. We have podcast number 523, which is a training podcast titled Squat Depth Based on Goals. So some people don't need to go to parallel. Some people damn sure do. It just kind of depends on what your goals are and what your body mechanics and whatnot allow. But in general, squatting with a PVC pipe is what you would want to go to after doing kettlebell pickups. You can work on whether you want the heels elevated, not elevated. You can work on upper back stabilization with the PVC pipe, which gets them ready for a barbell. Now, if they have poor upper body mobility, poor shoulder mobility, and you notice, holy crap, they have a lot of strain, or they just can't get their hands up onto the PVC pipe across their upper back. Well, keep doing the kettlebell pickups, but then start really focusing on postural health. Now, you should be doing this actually from the get-go. You should be doing this from the first day you trained them. But what you're going to need to work on is strength of the lower traps and internal-external rotational ability of the shoulders. For strengthening the lower traps, we do this within the warm-up. Your warm-up should actually have this involved. We have a podcast titled The Best Warm-Up Routine. It's podcast number 1112, so 1112. A training podcast titled The Best Warm-Up Routine. It'll explain why I should already be addressing this. But I like YTWs on the floor, cobra raises, Cuban presses, swimmers. There's a bunch of other things for lower traps. Now, to work on internal, external rotation of the shoulders, there's a video we have on YouTube titled Brutal Iron Gym, Treatment for Internal, External Rotation of the Shoulders. So you can search that. So you want to work on those aspects while you continue to work on strengthening the core, glutes, hamstrings, quads, and continuing to work on hip mobility, which, as I said, you should be doing from day one. And we can learn about that in podcast 1112, Training the Best Warm-Up Routine. Then also knowing how to structure their lower body workouts so you have all the elements included. We have podcast 1245, training podcast titled Leg Training, Exercise Selection Considerations. So that's going to help you put together the best workout from the get-go, so you're already working on upper body mobility and lower body mobility, as well as strengthening in the tissues that are going to allow them to get to the position they need to be in by the time they progress to squatting with a PVC pipe. So you PVC pipe squats to a box at first if needed for confidence, then without a box. Then you get to a barbell squat. So barbell squat, again, we have that YouTube video, Brutal Iron Gym squat setup and tips. That's going to be the way you can learn how to progress them through all the different cues for setting them up. You can start with box squats as a great way to just give them confidence. If they feel like they're going to screw up, they're already sitting down. No worries at the bottom. You can eventually progress them up to, no box, or some people I progressed to like letting them touch bands. I set bands up in the height of our squat racks, the height of their parallel, so they can feel themselves touching the bands, but it's not full assistance, so they can't like deload into the box. But it lets them have like more confidence that they're getting to a parallel position. Then eventually we progress to no box at all. So that is a efficient, but covers all the needs kind of process to get somebody from a barbell bodyweight squat to a barbell squat. So it was bodyweight squats to a bench, then without a bench, like bodyweight squats to a bench. Sorry, that's the first thing. Then kettlebell pickups while performing bodyweight squat to a bench. Then kettlebell pickups without the bench, which is essentially just kettlebell deadlifts. And then squatting with a PVC pipe with a box, then without a box, then a barbell with a box, then without a box. So you can have all of that as you progress through all of your workouts. So we said to create a full workout, you want to have, actually, podcast 970 is a training podcast titled Universal Workout Structure. So just use that. Listen to podcast 970. It'll teach you how to put together their workouts. Where the strength element is in your workout, you would use these cues, like these, exercise progressions. So you would start them with the bodyweight squat to a bench, then kettlebell pickups from a bench, then kettlebell pickups without a bench, then squatting with a PVC pipe, then squatting with a barbell. And you would have them do that in their kind of strength portion of the workout, but you would still have the warm-up and movement prep. You would still have muscle damage work. You'd still have conditioning work all within the same workout. So that way you still get all of the other elements you need while you're also progressing the squat. And again, that's podcast 970. That'll teach you universal workout structure. Okay, so that is one way. There's many others, but that's one way that you can efficiently progress somebody from bodyweight squat to a barbell squat. Cool. Okay, now we have some other helpful podcasts. There's going to be a lot here. Like there's about 8. So if you feel overwhelmed, all you have to do is write down the ones that you think interest you or that you want to know more about. But I want to throw these out there because they're related and they can be helpful. Podcast number 2. So at the beginning of time, way long ago, podcast number 2, it's a training podcast titled Why Just Squat Isn't Good Advice. So if you're wanting to get better at squatting, or you're wanting your client to get better at squatting, we might think, okay, well, I'm just making them squat, and that helps. No. That is one element of what will help. It absolutely 100% is not the only thing you should be doing. So podcast number 2, why just squat isn't good advice. So if somebody ever tells you, you're like, well, how do I get better at squatting? They're like, just squat. Horrible advice. Now, podcast 246 is a training podcast titled Reducing Low Back Pain During Squats and Deadlifts. So if you're experiencing, or if your client is experiencing, lower back pain during squats and deadlifts, that would be a pretty good podcast to listen to, number 246. Then we have podcast 523 we mentioned, which is a training podcast titled Squat Depth Based on Goals. Not everybody needs a squat to parallel, so that's good to listen to find out who does and who doesn't. Podcast 721 is a Q&A podcast titled Common Corrections for Squat, Bench, and Deadlift. So once somebody is squatting with a barbell, and actually even when they're in the PVC pipe, squatting with a PVC pipe, that podcast will be super helpful to understand what to analyze in your squat or the client's squat and how you can make quick, easy fixes. Podcast 721. Podcast 727 is a training podcast titled Specialty Bars for Squatting. So you would learn, why do people use something other than a barbell? Why do they use a safety squat bar or a camera bar or blah, blah, blah bar? Then podcast 807 is a training podcast titled Should I Wear Olympic Lifting Shoes When I Squat? We mentioned that one. We also mentioned, we didn't mention this one, is podcast 1118. It's a Q&A podcast titled Should Aesthetic Athletes Do Heavy Squats and Deadlifts? So if you're a bodybuilder, figure, fitness, physique, wellness, bikini, whatever the other 47 divisions are, podcast 1118 covers your needs. Should you squat heavy and deadlift heavy? Then finally, last one is podcast 1134. It's a Q&A podcast titled Self-Identifying Individual Specific Training Focal Points for Squats. What the hell does that mean? It helps you analyze your squat and know where you are weak at, So then you know what exercises to choose to help build up your squat. Pretty helpful. And that's podcast 1134. So I gave you about like 17 years worth of podcasts to listen to. There's actually very helpful. You can actually probably get through all those in a week or two. But they're very helpful. They let you learn a lot. If you're a trainer, you should listen to every damn one of these because you're going to want to know the information. If you're just somebody training yourself, it would still be helpful. You don't have necessarily as much of a drive to do it, but I hope you still do it. This is kind of how you can progress yourself. So if you find yourself somewhere in the middle, you'll know the next steps to do. If you find yourself starting from the beginning, you know where to go. So this is just something helpful for all of us. If you have any questions, any follow-up, concerns, questions, anything you want to learn more about, shoot me an email at brittlirongym@gmail.com. Awesome. Well, I hope this was helpful. If you do like our podcast, please consider sharing it. The more people we share our podcast with, the more people we can help with the podcast. And that's the whole goal. Thank you to the patrons of the podcast, the people who financially support the podcast, which you can now do on our website at www.brittlirongym.com. The podcast costs well over $1,000 a year for hosting costs. I give an hour to it every single day. I would love to keep it for free. And the only way I can do that in any way that makes sense is due to the financial help that we do get. So thank you so much to everybody. It really makes a big difference. So that's why, like on our website, we have the option to do a one-time donation, monthly donation, yearly donation. Whatever you can give is truly appreciated. I do genuinely appreciate it. Thank you. If you like the information we share in our podcast, you can find more from us on our social media channels, on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and at YouTube under the name Brittle Iron Gym. If you have any questions, feedback, suggestions, anything that you want to know, let us know at our email at brittlirongym@gmail.com. As always, I hope this was helpful, and thank you for listening.